Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy
the
the
interview.
Today we are joined by the member for Crowley, Peter Lamb. Peter Lamb, thank you for joining us today.
Morning. It's Crawley, is how we pronounce it
Crawley,
here. But fair
Crawley,
enough.
Crawley.
Yeah.
Yes. No.
But funny analogy to that is that have you ever seen Good Omens, the Terry Pratchett Neil Gaiman series?
I think I'm a bit too young for that.
It's on Amazon. Well, it's out at the moment. But it's a series where you got two angels living on Earth, talking to them, and one of the characters starts off with the name Crawley and ends up with the name Crowley because he starts off as a snake. But Neil Gaiman lived outside of Crawley for a long time.
Oh, okay.
And so he said apparently he originally named him on the basis of the town of Crawley. So slight parallel there.
Slight parallel there for sure. So, so just for our audience out there, Peter, can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the questions, and maybe a bit about your lecture at Crawley for our international Australian audience who may not know an entire lot about the UK in general.
So if you visit the UK, you've actually got a reasonable chance of visiting my constituency, even though you wouldn't know it. Crawley is home to the busiest single runway airport in the world, Gatwick, which plays a significant role in terms of our local economy and has had a growing role over time. But the town itself, the name Crawley means a clearing for crows. And it was an Anglo-Saxon community that's mentioned in the Domesday Book, the record of all the villages and towns that are around in sort of 1080s when William the Conqueror compiled it. Its history really starts to get going, though, in the mid 20th century when the Labour Party, following the Second World War, decided that we were going to build a series of new towns surrounding the major metropolitan areas to deal with both the fact that an awful lot of housing had been lost in the Blitz, but even before that, there was an awful lot of slum housing. And it was a reforming socialist government that came in. They built our National Health Service and a number of other key public services. But one of the things that they did was to decide to build these towns. And Crawley was one of those locations that they chose halfway between London and the South Coast to be one of these towns. And it was a really ambitious project. I mean, they moved whole industries down. So we had a very, very vibrant industrial sector. And that part of town still is an enormous sort of level of business going on there. In fact, the town itself has got the second highest density of employment in the country outside of London, despite not being desperately well known. We're a population size of only about 120,000, but we have a fairly significant economic footprint in the UK. But when they built the town, it was entirely council housing to start with, or more or less entirely council housing. And it was families that moved out of South London to try and start a new life together. One of the interesting facts about that is when you start looking at immigration, and patterns of immigration start fairly early because of the airport being present here. I can literally say that the foundations of my town were laid by migrants because it was Irish day labourers who came over who built all the foundations for all of the council housing in Crawley. What has happened over time is when they first started building these new towns, they said to people that you'll have homes for you, for your kids, and for your grandkids. But they never kept building. In fact, in the 1980s, in 1984, Margaret Thatcher's government passed legislation which meant that the vast majority of our council housing has gradually been sold off over time. And so what you get is a significant change in demographics and voting patterns which stem out of that. Before that point, Crawley had always been very solidly Labour. It was a small community because it was growing, so it was within other constituencies, but the town itself was always incredibly Labour. It's become one of the UK's sort of key bellwether marginals at elections. Whichever party wins the seat tends to win the country. In fact, that's always been the case. Whichever party wins the seat wins the country, including in sort of hung parliament scenarios. But it's one of the sort of more diverse bits of the southeast. But we have our challenges, despite the high level of businesses here. Housing, because of all the issues in terms of not continuing to build, because of the enormously high house prices in the UK, and the fact that because we have got a big economy, a lot of people want to live here. We've got the second worst housing crisis by some metrics in the country. We've got the worst social mobility in the entire region. People do find employment here because the airport provides a lot of the jobs, as do a lot of the local businesses. But typically, they're not going to ever do better than their parents did. And so these present enormous challenges for UMP coming in to say, well, actually, let's try and revisit this. Let's try and make sure that we're going to have the housing that's going to give people a decent start in life and to progress in their lives and have career paths that enable them to really get on and make the absolute most of their talents. Because I was born here, I went to school here. Absolutely, kids here are as capable as anywhere else,
Mm,
but the system's currently letting them down.
mm. And going back to the fact, talking about the bellwether seat as well, there's not many of, I wouldn't assume there's many of those bellwether seats anymore, considering, what's been happening the last couple of years in the UK in differences, in terms of elections, a lot of safe
Yeah.
seats in the north were lost to the Conservatives in 2019, and a lot of them were won back, and a lot of safe Conservative seats in 2024 were lost to either the Lib Dems or Labour Party. So, it's quite interesting that Crawley still kept that bellwether status even after all this time.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional bellwethers are seats that have now got sort of reasonable Labour majorities. They're still marginal, but decent majorities. If you look at the last election in July, the average Labour seat now has got a majority of about 6,000, and that goes right into places that used to be solid, safe seats. Because the vote has become increasingly fragmented. We did a very effective job of targeting resources to maximise seats, but the landscape is now incredibly complicated, where you've got some incredibly safe traditional Conservative seats that we've now got majorities of a couple of hundred in, at the same time as having very safe, traditionally safe Labour seats that, due to pressures from the Greens and from other parties on the left, have really been reduced quite a lot. So the electoral map is incredibly complicated. You're still going to get seats like Crawley that remain those bellwether marginals, because when you look at the demographics, that is that constituency. It's fairly evenly balanced between the two parties, and then has this solid swing group that will go one way or the other depending upon the electoral circumstances. But certainly, I think you can arguably say that in 2019, the Conservative Party overreached, and in 2024, the Labour Party has probably overperformed in those circumstances. It seems unlikely you're going to continue to get majority of that size endlessly.
Mm,
But one thing we need to be very conscious of is that, as time's gone on, I'm less and less convinced that you really persuade large numbers of people. You can persuade some people. Circumstances will ultimately push a lot of voters, but the overwhelming majority of elections are determined by demographics. And demographics do change over time. And one of the big things that's happening in the UK around that are, firstly, because our economy is so centralised around London, any kid who goes off and gets a degree and wants to do better in life tends to gravitate towards London, or to a lesser extent some of the other key cities like Manchester. And what they do is they go there, they're young, they have left wing or lean left overall in terms of their politics. And when they finally want to start settling down because of house prices, they can't afford to live in those cities. They're just insanely expensive. So they start moving out to suburbs. And what you're seeing across a lot of the southeast, which is traditionally the Conservative Party's strongest sort of part of the UK, is that these towns that have got railway stations heading into London, fast railway stations, have suddenly all gone Labour. And a big part of that, and I can tell from the bit of Crawley that I live in, the people who were buying houses when I was trying to buy a house, they were all coming out of London, and they've all got sort of left-leaning politics by virtue of both age and education. And education in the UK, much as in most other states, is increasingly a good predictor of whether or not someone's going to vote left or right.
exactly.
Affects things. So first off, you've got that shift around housing pushing all those pressures. The second thing's around clustering. That this is the first ever election where the baby boomers' impact is not as significant as it once was. So the baby boomers remain the largest generation in absolute terms in the UK, but they're more heavily clustered into a fewer number of areas. So for the first time ever, we now have millennials as the single largest demographic in most constituencies. And if you want to look at Labour Party policy over that period of time, if you want to look at things like the fact that we've gone very heavily for housing this time, even though NIMBYism is remains alive here as much as anywhere else, you focus in on that fact that it's a generation that hasn't yet managed to settle down. And if you want to look at arguments at the moment around things like the winter fuel allowance, politically it doesn't come at a significant cost to the Labour Party to look at those kind of benefits. I mean, you've got to look at the social impact, and I can go into details as to why actually that's not going to cause any harm to any pensioners, but politically the Labour Party could get away with it because it's not going to affect the final result come the next election.
And I'm thinking about it in an Australian context as well, as you were saying. With the growth and expansion of London, it's very similar to the growth and expansion of Melbourne and Sydney in Australia. And as we've seen, probably not to the same extent, a lot of the I guess regional areas around Melbourne have always actually traditionally voted Labor. So there's places like Geelong, regional towns like Bendigo, Ballarat, which are growing now, but they've always really traditionally voted Labor. And a lot of the areas around the fringe, where a lot of growth is happening, is always been, quite safe Labor territory. So it's not very similar, I guess, in that sense to London, where, you've got those southeast sort of southeast England sort of seats where the Conservatives are starting to lose their majorities. But on that as well, there is a similarity in the sense that a lot of the safe liberal areas or conservative areas, as you like to call in the UK, in Melbourne, for example, have actually been lost to Labor and now the Teal Independents, which I don't know if you've heard a lot about the Teals in Australia, Peter, but it's really, as you were saying, a lot of younger people are moving towards these areas which are quite desirable, close to the city. A lot of the older generation, the older population is, slowly dying off, slowly, maybe moving to the countryside, sea change or tree change, as they'd like to say it. But yeah, it's changing as well here that, a lot of the safe sort of liberal or conservative seats, as you say, are changing and are becoming more and more marginal. And, those safe sort of traditional areas are now becoming more and more marginal. And even on the Labour
Yeah.
side as well, um, there is safe, as probably similar to like a northeast England sort of seat that have been safe for the Labour Party for quite a long time, maybe in outer Western Melbourne, outer Northern Melbourne, outer Western Sydney, are now starting to become more marginal towards third parties, whether that be right-wing third parties or the Liberal and National coalition.
I mean, there's a lot of parallel. I mean, first off, UK Australian politics there's an awful lot of overlap in general because of shared language and history, and frankly, we share a lot of politicos. I think your
Mm.
Labour Party was actually set up before our Labour Party.
Yeah, we're
Funny enough, but
1901, I think, when we were
yeah, well, I
1901,
think
something
we're
like
like
that.
we're roughly contemporary, but I think you slightly beat us. In terms of the we also exchange a lot of actual politicos. Like we will have had Australian Labour Party organisers over campaigning
Mm,
this year,
mm.
and we send over similarly
Yeah.
organisers to help when you
And there's
guys have general
also
elections.
there's
And
also been a lot of, British born Australian MPs and then a lot of Australian born British
yeah,
MPs. I think there's Catherine Webb
Julia
currently.
Gillard has got an event over here in a couple of weeks. I've been invited
Yeah.
to.
We've got
We talk a lot.
yeah. There's also Tracy
We
Roberts, who I've interviewed previously as well on the podcast. I think she's born in Manchester originally. So
yeah.
there's quite a lot of them.
There's a lot of overlap, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of conversation. Particularly, I think that the impact of Rupert Murdoch upon both political systems means there's a lot of dialogue between the tops of parties around how to manage the politics of that. But beyond that, we're seeing the same thing basically across the world.
Mm,
Particularly in terms of developed democracies. The US has that same issue in terms of big cities increasingly dominant, and then seeing those sort of suburban areas becoming a bit more sort of left leaning. You also see that across Europe. And it's something which has been noticed in general, and which I think to some extent is feeding into this increasing far right radicalization that we're seeing. You are seeing that there is this all the benefits, particularly as the internet means that you'd see a collapse of local shopping centres and sort of the economy becoming less sort of localized in individual communities. What you're finding is that yes, cities increasingly have got like this oversized role in our systems. They increasingly lean a particular way. And we're finding that across every single system that you've got that's happening, and with the differences of politics. The UK is a little bit worse than most in that in our case it doesn't tend to be multiple cities. It basically is just London. You do have some areas which are doing a bit better, but they're dwarfed by the impact of London, and we've become far too
mm,
London centric. I think that's something everyone more or less agrees with, even if London is fantastic for the UK. The wider concern around that, and it's where getting onto your point about losing sort of traditional Labour areas to Liberal than going marginal, is that what we found in Brexit, and which has affected an awful lot of politics in a lot of countries, is this concept that was described as being somewheres and nowheres. That you've got people who, due to having a high level of education and sort of a general metropolitan outlook,
mm.
could go anywhere and work anywhere and are comfortable with slipping into lots of different environments. They are regarded as being nowheres. They've got like no particular community that they're set to. Well, you've got a lot of people who haven't got those options, who are very highly the sense of self is grounded in those particular communities. Those are the somewheres, and you're finding this class, this de-alignment that's happening in the system, where those people are increasingly voting for more right-wing solutions around things, anti-immigration,
Mm.
sort of more isolationist politics. because they feel that all of this, the reasons why this communities are collapsing are all external factors. Those are the visible things. We know that for a fact that when you look at what's happening with the underlying stuff underneath in the economy, actually, these are drivers that are domestic as much as international, and they're going to keep going regardless of how much you try and put up a wall around the country. In fact, they get worse because you get less money to try and redistribute towards those poorer communities. But it's something I don't think anyone has quite got a handle on. We've talked a lot about levelling up in this country under the last government, and we're talking about sort of regional economic strategies now. But the reality is that since the 1980s, in particular, this drift towards London of wealth and employment and opportunity and of services and all the benefits in the country, and away from regional communities that had very strong industries traditionally, and now just very nothing really is based there, has become increasingly pronounced. And that's why people are increasingly opting for radical solutions, feeling nothing that anyone has tried so far has worked. And whichever left-wing party comes up with a solution that really manages to address this, it's going to be incredibly popular, I think, across sort of Western democracies. But we have yet to find it.
Yeah, and similar to here as well, as I was saying with those safe sort of Labour areas, not necessarily in the regions, of them in the outer suburbs. There's been a lot of change in the outer suburbs, especially, where me and Tobias live right now, in Point Cook. There's the major town in our area is called Werribee, which has had systemic change. I think back in the 1970s and 80s, there was like 4,000 or 5,000 people living in this area. Now there's close to 200, 300,000 people. So it's been a huge amount of change. And, you're seeing that older sort of population who've been here quite a while. And I know one of the pollsters here, Kosovar, has done a lot of stuff on this. The older sort of population that's been in these sort of outer suburbs and towns for 30, 40 years plus, they're more shifting towards the Liberals and more right-wing sort of options. And then you're getting the new migrants who are coming into these areas who are keeping the Labour vote going, but it's getting closer and closer as there's more and more of the older class in those areas shifting towards centre-right or right-leaning parties. And then with the more migrants coming in, it's a bit of a balancing act there, but it's getting more marginal and more marginal, as you said. And that does go back to the fact that a lot of the older generations who live out here have seen a lot of change, and a lot of them, I think, in a sense, as what I've seen, with them, they're quite conservative sometimes. They don't really they perceive change as in a way as being bad. So there's always talks here in Australia about increasing the mining tax levy that we have, but a lot of the people in the mining industry, in the mining seats like Hunter in New South Wales and a lot of the Queensland seats where the mining industry is so important, those are key vote areas because they're marginal seats. And both political parties, Labor and Liberal, don't want to make a decision on that because the people who live there perceive that if there's any change towards the mining industry, it's going to be bad for them. So they're going to vote for the alternative that's sticking with the status quo. So that's the issue that we have here, that a lot of the 40, 50 plus residents of these sort of areas, whether that be rural mining areas or outer suburban working class areas, they're shifting towards the centre right and to the Liberals, and to even more extreme options like One Nation, if you've heard of them, and the United Australia Party, just because of this perceived thing that change for them is really, really bad.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's those more extreme parties actually that we're seeing. Certainly, it's the last election hoovering up votes because the Conservatives have proved to no longer be for those groups sufficiently extreme. And there is a slight concern I have that if we are able to deliver what we hope to in the next 5 years, that you can see some of that vote or more of that vote heading that direction, which is what we've seen across Europe. The one thing that kind of holds that back is the fact we've got first past the post as an electoral system, which tends to benefit sort of entrenched establishment parties. But that only get you so far overall. I mean, it's interesting. We have a similar parallel around sort of environmental impact with the North Sea oil industry that we're sharing a debate around at the moment. It's not as large a community as the UK, and the seats, while they are important, forming part of the Labour Party's sort of target areas, are sufficiently smaller numbers to not have the same level of impact as it probably has within Australia. But the fact that they're represented by these industries, are represented very effectively by trade unions, and in the Labour Party in the UK, I don't know how it's set up in Australia, but in our basis, the trade unions are a fundamental part of the Labour Party.
Yep.
They have boards in our national executive and all the rest of it. So it's there's a lot of pressure from that. And so what we have to do is come up with a solution to say, well, okay, that industry is going away, but how do we ensure that the future of the UK's energy industry and other potential industries can go straight into those communities as those other things are winding down? And for me personally, I think about this a lot in the context of my community, that if we can't find a way to make aviation sustainable, there's going to have to be less aviation, and that will have a significant knock-on effect to my community. And so trying to diversify our industry has become very, very important, particularly because during COVID, we're the biggest economic hit in the entire country because of the level of connectivity with aviation across our local economy.
Hmm.
In terms of the broader point about conservatism and people going more conservative because of change, it's a rational thing if you think about it. You know, it's rational that people, as they get older, I mean, actually, we're finding that millennials are getting more radical as they get older because they're finding that they've lost out on every single bit of the system as they work their way through.
As you've
It's
seen
being
with like
taken away.
with the recent elections in Germany, last
Yeah,
weekend, you saw a lot of, even the younger 18, 24-year-olds voted for the far right, had the biggest vote share, I think, for the far right political party, AFD there, in
yeah.
Thuringia and
Well,
Saxony, which is quite extraordinary.
young boys is a particular issue. We're finding that young women are leaning towards green and more progressive options, and young boys are leaning more towards sort of far right options.
Hmm.
And I do not doubt that YouTube and videos by increasingly toxic people have a way of playing into that. In addition to the fact that there is a general level of insecurity around what it is to be, I think, a man in 21st century, and people are reaching out for options. And unfortunately, the only answers they're finding at the moment are quite toxic ones. And I think that's driving a lot of that sort of more extremist politics, which again we have to find a solution to. But on this broader issue of like conservatism amongst older generations and amongst these communities which have experienced change and aren't used to it, it is a rational reaction. If you're in a community, if you're in an age group that's less capable of adapting, if you are in an income bracket that's less capable of adapting to change, change poses a risk to you. You know what the current situation is. You know that you can adapt to it in various ways. You know that if you've got a strong community, you've got the community support. And if you see your community changing, the perception is you no longer have that level of community support. So I think there's a rational element to this we have to grapple with. And there's a model that I've worked with previously in other roles called values modes, which tries to understand the underlying psychology of a lot of this stuff and how to pitch particular things to people to try and make them feel more comfortable with change, or to in general support a series of changes because they feel it's okay for their particular circumstances. But I think it's important not to view these people who are resistant to change as just being inherently incapable of understanding what's going on. Like they might point at the wrong things as being the triggers behind it, but it is very much for those people a rational reaction to the fact that they are insecure in their sort of economic, social circumstances, and that they have a need to have some support in adapting because their support structures are going away, and it's a challenge. I think there are ways they've done it well in some places, but it's not something at the national level, at the regional level, anyone has really done very effectively over time. But it does pose a challenge for the future. But like I said about changing demographics earlier, one of the things about sort of aging, not just people moving into areas, is that ultimately whatever the population was there 5 years ago, 5 years worth of people at the older end of that spectrum will no longer be living there, if I can put it as delicately as that. So you will find over time that the politics shifts purely because generations are aging out of the electorate, and priorities change and experiences through life change as a result. So you can never take an air for granted. You constantly have to be looking at the data to see, what is this community today, and getting out there and just, there is absolutely no alternative, no matter how much technology we develop around election science, to just going out on the doorstep and talking to as many people as possible.
Exactly. You got to be an active member in the community, or else, at the end of the day, if you're not, you're probably not going to get reelected. So that's the most important thing, in my opinion, of course. So we'll move on actually now to our first question then for you, Peter. I know it's been about 30 minutes there. Great chat, of course, a great chat. But yeah, our first question to you, Peter, is how was your high school and university life? And do you have any memorable moments you'd like to share on the podcast?
So my local school was Holy Trinity in Crawley. I think we were really lucky with the teachers we had, to be honest. And I suspect a lot of people feel that about whatever school they went to, but I genuinely feel that we had a team there that was had strong pastoral care, potentially because of the religious aspect to the institution, that they felt there to provide that pastoral care. But in particular, there were several teachers who worked very hard to promote debates and understanding and thinking about social issues, to create democratic structures within the school that we could participate within. Frankly, I was probably too difficult to those people at the time. I've always been inclined to push back against authority structures, but I tried to do so in a constructive and respectful way. But I suspect when you look back, you realise your teachers were a lot younger than you thought they were at the time. And I probably could have been easier to work with. But I genuinely feel that a lot of the people I went to school with have done very well, in large part because we had teachers who, outside of the standard educational side of things, inspired us to try and find who we really were. And certainly a lot of the first steps I took within politics. I mean, I do come from a Labour Party family of people where every election you go out, you deliver leaflets. I was in my pram doing that with my dad when I was little. But that inclination towards engaging and being actively involved in the political system, certainly there was a lot of push that came out of that particular school. Heading into university, I went to university in 2004, but the Labour Society there had just collapsed because of the Iraq War. It was a fairly difficult time to be young radical and a Labour Party supporter, because none of these things seem to coalesce very well. And so you see sort of quite a left-wing presence arising. I went to university at Southampton, which, given where I live, is quite amazing. I managed to find an even more southern university to go to, but it's sort of on the coast. But certainly, I did a degree in modern history and politics, and then I did a master's degree in citizenship and governance. But the most significant part of my education, in terms of actually doing politics later on, certainly did not take place within the lecture hall. It was getting involved in setting up another Labour Society, helping to, being chair of the Union Council, being actively involved in student politics, writing, being editor on the student newspaper, very much the debating society, practicing and honing your skills. All that side of things develop, and you start making connections through the Labour, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, through the Labour Society in my university. You start meeting other people in other societies across the country, and a lot of those people are now members of parliament. Some of them are very senior secretaries of state in the new government. So absolutely the grounding, and if anyone is young, is interested in getting involved in politics, I'd absolutely encourage them, spread your wings as wide as possible at university with meeting people and being active in political structures, because you will find that the network that you're building at university is one that will follow you probably for the rest of your life, in terms of politics. So that was my experience of university and high school.
And do you have any other specific memorable moments you'd like to share on the podcast? If it's something illegal or something like that. I know some people have regret not said anything like that because they don't want to be telling too many secrets. But do you have anything specific you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, there's various compromising moments involving senior members of the Labour Party. Student societies, whether they're political or not. I went to Gordon Brown's launch event for his prime ministerial bid for the Labour Party. We got invited in. We were not told what it was, and actually at the time, I was heavily considering voting for John McDonnell, who's one of our most left-wing members of Parliament, because I was young and radical. And I didn't exactly cover myself in glory, because I was chewing gum when he turned up to say hello to me, and I was desperately trying to swallow my gum while choking in front of him. So that's one particularly embarrassing memory for me, at least. Unfortunately, it's probably not the most embarrassing thing for him that day, because the team supporting him had not really scoped the venue in the way they should do. So he went up to give his speech, and had the cameras positioned over sort of back in front of him to the right. And as he went to speak, the auto cue came up and immediately covered his face between him and the TV cameras. So his launch speech ended up being a bit of a damp squib. And unfortunately, despite the fact I have enormous admiration for the man, and I think when he said he saved the world's banking economy, I think he genuinely did. In 2008, stop the stop the world going into a depression. It rather went on to characterise his political fortunes over the following 3 years, unfortunately.
We're up to our next question for you, Peter, and I think this is with Tobias.
Yeah, prior to Parliament, you served on council for nearly 14 years, and as a leader of Crawley Borough council for 10 of those years, are you able to talk to us a bit about your career in local government and some of the differences you have found in UK Parliament?
So yeah, I left university 2008, and I had planned on staying on and doing a PhD, but at the time, under Gordon Brown, it did look as if we were kind of sailing into the mud and there wasn't going to be a Labour Party anymore. And I thought, well, now's my only chance really if I want to do anything through the party, to get involved. So I started working for the Member of Parliament here, and I was a Labour Party organiser. So it was part-time one, part-time the other. And I ended up being put down for a council seat because at that point it was very hard to find anyone who was desperately interested to represent the Labour Party. No one really felt like losing. So I ended up putting myself down on a ballot paper for the ward that I actually continue to represent until tomorrow. I'm required to stand down within about 2 months of leaving of entering Parliament. It's a Labour Party rule as opposed to a national rule, but it's Northgate was the ward I represented, which had been run by our Liberal Democrat Party, which are not the right wing here. They're kind of midway between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But it'd been a Lib Dem ward for about 2 decades, and yeah, I put down my name for it. I was focused entirely on winning the constituency for the general election. I hadn't really given it much thought, but we did the count for the general election overnight, and the next morning we did the local election count, and I'd been elected with for the ward a reasonable majority. So suddenly here I was, instead of going back to university, I was on a local authority. And I was the youngest member of my group, not quite the youngest on the council. But I got stuck in, as I do with everything, tried to learn everything as quickly as possible. And when 2 years later the leader of our group decided to stand down, it was quite clear at that point we were one election away from taking control of the council. Crawley Council had been Labour from when the borough was formed as its own independent political entity, right up until 2006, when the Labour Party's vote across local government just collapsed. So we were looking to get back in, having been out for the first time in our history. A lot of the people who'd been involved up to that point were no longer involved. A lot of them had kind of aged out of the system. We still had our longest serving councillor available, although he was going to stand down at the next election. That was Bert Crane, who sort of helped, frankly, build the town from the start, really, in the 50s. It was the longest continuous service in the country by a councillor at the time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
when did he start his council career? Was that back in like the 60s, 70s, or
it was the 50s. He joined in the 50s on the previous model of the council. His dad had been involved with it as well. But yeah, he was never officially leader, but we had kind of this dual working relationship between the secretary of the Labour group on the council, who sort of was the voice of the party, and the leader of the council, which for much of his time was a guy called Alf Pegler, who's the only person we've got like a bust of in the town, who again was one of the people who just built Crawley, really, over the years. So I, despite being the youngest member of the group, when the leader at the time decided to stand down, I was concerned that we didn't really have a clear plan for what we wanted to do if we got back in. A lot of the experience around budgets have been lost. And I did a lot of work to get myself up to speed, and then I ran for leader when they stood down. And to the surprise of most of the longer serving members of the group, I won. Mostly because I'd taken on board the very simple lesson that a lot of people don't, that it's not about whether or not the loudest voices or the most significant length of service people in the room support you. It's about whether or not you get more people overall. And the people who felt that they had not necessarily been respected by other people were more inclined to look for someone else who might respect them. So it's a good lesson for anyone that every member of the electorate is ultimately equal in terms of their
exactly. Everyone has
value.
one vote.
Absolutely. And yeah, they get to choose how they use it. I then spent 2 years as leader of the opposition, pretty much full time working on just trying to develop our manifesto, reading everything I possibly could, getting every data set I possibly could about the constituency, meeting all the key stakeholders, meeting Labour leaders from across the country, and putting together a plan that ended up really being the plan that we've kind of run with ever since in terms of development, which is about trying to broaden and diversify the local economy, increase the skills base to tackle social deprivation, build affordable housing. During most of my time as leader, we were top 10 in the country for building new affordable housing. We saw significant growth in our economic development, lots of additional businesses moving in, attracting a couple of £100 million worth of private investment in terms of the infrastructure and facilities within the town. Not that if you talk to residents, they see a lot of that, to be honest, but the town saw significant investment throughout that period of time. But what ultimately you start running into, if you do it long enough, you find that you start running into the same sets of problems. They never really go away, and the solutions you start to feel after a while, maybe it's time for someone else to try and give it some thought. Other aspects you find at national level problems that you simply can't address because other people from above are pushing down on you. And we've got a fairly depowered local government sector in the UK. It's both we both have councils that are more distant in terms of like population size than most European states. In fact, every other European state has got councils with smaller population size and smaller electoral units than we do here. And they tend to have more significant powers. We lost a lot of our powers in the 80s when Thatcher didn't want socialist councillors compromising her neoliberal agenda, and so depowered. And most of the utilities that got privatised had actually previously been run by the local councils in those areas and had been built by them. So you get fairly frustrated that the things that you want to do to improve your local community are things that you can't really affect on the ground beyond a certain level. And in 2022, I decided to stand down for it, partly because my wife wanted me out of politics. She'd been a councillor herself. She'd been mayor of the town. She'd acted as mayor for a year and kind of was done with it. And so I was just leaving. I was going to go do something else with the rest of my life. Until she happened to sit at a wedding next to a former member of parliament. She said, look, if he's ever going to go for it, you want to do it when you've got a young family so they don't get bullied at school, which is, I think, a lesson for an awful lot of people that, your family take a big brunt of it. And,
that is true.
There was a very senior politician who, I know for a fact stepped down because of the bullying that their child was facing in school. It's not really reasonable. And it puts, the system should not require the people in the roles to be only the people who've got the toughest skin or haven't got families or frankly are borderline psychopathic. But the way social media and an awful lot of people's attitudes are pushing, they're pushing for the very worst quality representatives to be the only people in the system with that kind of pressure. So it was agreed that I could run, put myself forward, won the selection and won the election. And there was a thing famously that we'd observed for a long time, that former council leaders don't tend to be very happy members of parliament. And there was some truth to that when you first get in, and it's not a surprise when you're a council leader, you have immediate powers over your local community. You can directly affect what happens with sort of the levers in your office. Problems are manageable. You're hands-on. It's not just a case of strategically planning things out. Being a member of parliament is very different. You are affecting legislation, you're writing, you're trying to lobby people. You have very little direct control over things. You're trying to use influence and negotiation to achieve things. And ultimately, you are part of a large voting bloc on legislation. Within our local government sector, it's collective decision making as well. So I go along to my Labour group meeting. I will vote for what policy I want. And the fact that I was leader of the council ultimately did not mean that I would necessarily win that vote. The Labour Party's policy may be something that I actively did not want, and it was my job as leader to go out and sell that because I'd been in the room and I'd had a say, and while I'd lost, that was a Labour Party position. As a Labour Party MP, there was an expectation you will vote with whatever the Prime Minister or Secretary of State comes up with, and it's understandable that at a national level you can't have a thorough debate involving, at this point, sort of over 400 Labour MPs around something, but it's a very different level of input. And you're relying much more upon backbench committees and things like that to try and nudge things in the right direction around national policy. So there is a level of frustration you experience shifting from local government to central government because the scale means your voice is much, much diminished compared to what it once was. But the real goal is to try and grapple with those issues that I faced with as a council leader that I couldn't address on the local level and try and facilitate it so that the guy who's now stepped into my shoes is a good friend of mine. When he goes out and tries to resolve those problems, he's got someone in national government or at the national level who's pushing for the exact same sets of things for the community. So I'd say it was a necessary step heading into Westminster to try and get those things changed. But that doesn't mean that it's not, in some ways, a disappointing transition from a role where you can every day take decisions that affect things to a role where the power exists, potentially at a more significant level, but is much more subtle. if I can put it that way.
Mm, mm. Very interesting there as well. And just in terms of what councils really focus on in the UK and what the national and actual UK government focuses on, I'm guessing it's quite similar to Australia. UK, in Australia, because councils here they focus on rates, maintenance of public areas and public spaces, and that sort of thing. And then national government will focus on more towards education, defense, those sort of issues, immigration. So is it probably quite similar there? We also have a state government which
Yeah.
focuses on different things as well, which is a bit different, but
Yeah, I mean, we have devolved bodies, obviously, in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland that act sort of on some level like a state government. We also increasingly have these sort of combined authorities, which are mayoral elected mayors with a series of council leaders which sit underneath, which act as another tier at a sort of a large city level. But to be frank, UK subnational government is an absolute mess. It's not uniform. Everything's different. We have like 4 different categories of mayor that you can technically be, depending upon what institution you're part of. It's very confusing. I don't know why they called the latest elected mayors. Like they should have called them governors or something. It'd be a closer representation of what they're actually doing. And then there are some areas where you'll have now 4 different tiers of government. So you'll have this combined authority, which is overseeing transport at a much larger level, potentially with some control over the National Health Service within that area and things like that. You then have your county council, and your county council will be dealing with adult social care, child social care, education, road, not rail, sorry. Rail could be combined authority technically. Highways, libraries, fire service. Below that, you'll get the district councils. District councils control housing, economic development, leisure services, cultural services within that community. Planning process is a particularly key one for those communities. And then below that, you've got another tier called the parish councils, which I think are actually the oldest tier, technically, of local government in the UK, which have no statutory responsibilities, but have a potentially unlimited budget if they raise a precept in the local area. So everything they do is discretionary, but it can sometimes be very useful. And while I've mentioned all those different tiers, that's the maximum number of tiers you're likely to have. But you could have as few as 1 tier, or you could have all 4 of those tiers. And it's just history which dictates which you end up with. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess.
It is. And there's even some people in Australia that say, they really shouldn't be state governments in a sense. It really should all just be council, and really in a sense this should just be, some people do argue there should just be one form of government, being the national government as well, just because, and give all responsibilities to them, because sometimes states and territories will argue with the federal government about whether this issue relates to them, and then they'll blame the federal government, for example, if they want to get, because there's some infrastructure projects, transport infrastructure projects, where the federal government will give funding and the state government will blame this federal government for not giving enough funding. That's why it's being delayed. So there's a bit of basically throwing the ball back in their court and hitting it back, that sort of thing. It is it's quite an interesting sort of scenario where sometimes state governments, of course, won't try and take responsibility and they'll blame someone else, and sometimes it's probably the federal government in a sense.
I mean, I mean, we spent a long time blaming the EU for things that are still here because actually they make perfect sense, but it was more convenient than admitting to the voter that they were wrong about something. In terms of I mean, we get into arguments about like how confusing voters find all the different tiers of government. I don't think it's beyond people's understanding. I also don't think it's necessarily the biggest consideration. I think from the position of the electorate, what they'd ideally like is one person to have all the power in the country and fix every problem. They like the idea that you can go to someone and just get the problem resolved. It's complicated explaining to people that power is much more fragmented. And it's a good thing that it's fragmented, actually, because you don't want tyranny. You want the ability for a system to ensure that no one abuses things for their own benefit, or that considerations across the sector have to be taken into account around things. But it does have a knock-on effect to the fact that it's much harder to get things done, and people find that very frustrating, understandably. The principle really, I think, is one of subsidiarity, which essentially is that decision-making should be taken at the lowest level it is possible to do so, or is practical to do so, because you're going to end up with the best decisions being taken that way for that particular community. It is democratic because you vote for the people who take that decision in that area. I get very annoyed when newspapers talk about postcode lotteries when something's determined by councils, because people have chosen in that community that they want to go down that particular way. It's not a postcode lottery at all. The other aspect to it is just about levels of attention. The UK government has got far too much going on to focus in on whether or not there should be a new traffic regulation order covering crossways and through bridges, because the parking since the last one has been increasingly hassle. You might want someone with the ultimate power to do that, but they're literally never going to get around to it. A classic example of this actually around Scottish Parliament versus the British Parliament is feudalism still exists in Scotland. Land ownership is still technically feudal, until you get a Scottish Parliament that came along with parliamentary time to deal with it, because they could never find time in Westminster to address the issue. So subsidiarity gives local people the best opportunity to have a say democratically. It ensures that decision making has the time to deal with local issues, and by and large, it's going to probably produce the best outcomes if people in the community are deciding what they want for their community. But it is very messy and it is very complicated for people, and people like playing games, tearing up systems and rebuilding them from scratch.
Yeah, it is quite complicated just to understand all levels of government and what their responsibilities are. Even, so I've been trying to get my head around these sort of things for like the past couple of years, and it is quite annoying to do so. And the average person in Australia, because we do have a compulsory voting system, unlike you guys in the UK. I think we might be one of the only countries in the world with a compulsory voting system, which is quite good. People get the say in terms
I
of
think
what
in Italy it's almost compulsory. You can never get any job that's public sector if you haven't got a completed book of stamps indicating that you voted. That's a sort of a solution post Mussolini, to try and stop fascism getting in and getting a low turnout. Yeah, I mean, I know councillors. I mean, the first few years any councillor is on a council, they have absolutely no idea what's the power in their council and what's the other council.
Yeah, it's a turbulent time, and it's quite hard for even for people who are involved in politics sometimes to understand. And that's probably exacerbated with people who don't really care too much about politics. We only really care when election times come. So yeah, I think we'll move on now to our next question then for you, Peter, and I think this comes again from Tobias.
Yes. While researching about you, we've seen that you have a active social media page and trying to post daily updates about being a MP. How important do you think social media is now for politics, and how can it be also harmful?
Personally, I think if social media collapsed tomorrow, it'll probably be an improvement for society. And I did wonder. I think you guys had an issue, didn't you, with the government was threatening Facebook, that they were going to have to pay for like journalism, and Facebook saying they're going to turn Facebook off in Australia. And I thought, why are they giving you like the best outcome? Like if they're going to agree to turn off Facebook, that'd be better for everyone involved. Look, I think you need every tool available. In your trunk. The problem which you've got as an elected representative is ultimately you are there to both try and put the views of your community across to national government, and also to engage them in a conversation about issues, to explain why you might not feel a particular way, and to see whether or not people engage with that argument, to explain things. And traditionally, the only medium you had available for that really were either going around personally, which we do. I've basically knocked doors every weekend in Crawley since 2008 when I got back from university, but there's a limit to the number of people you're going to see over the course of that. Even in the intense period of the general election, that you're going to see only roughly half the population as a party, never mind as an individual representative. We have very large electoral units, like I say, in terms of local government, the same as national government, which in the end limits the level of public engagement between representatives and the people they're there to represent. So having some tool which enables you to talk directly with people, particularly because media is increasingly fragmented. Back when we had four channels here, it was fairly hard to get on, but you knew that if you got on one of those channels, the public was going to know what you're talking about in terms of TV or in terms of radio, in terms of newspapers. These days, it's massively fragmented, and it poses a real challenge. And social media at least means that for the people who want to come and see what you're about, and hopefully you can latch onto them, and a lot of the effort is just trying to get people to like your page so they can continue to see your content and engage with it. They can see what your messaging is if they want to understand why you did something, and it's all there. So you try to be engaging. The problem really is that the people who really need to see it are usually not the ones who tend to follow it. I get a lot of abuse on my page, and I can tell you, I know for a fact, most of those people do not live in the constituency. They're people who have strong opinions, who are going around trolling. which is
Mm,
fine. I don't bother banning people unless they really give me a strong reason to,
yeah,
because frankly, it's more hassle overall than it's worth. And most people don't read below the initial story, so the only
exactly.
people reading below are either of a strong opinion one way or the other. On Twitter, I just mute anyone who just wants to have a go consistently. Like,
Mm,
I'm not going to stop you engaging my content. It's going to be available for you to see, and you can talk to other people if you want. But most people are not interested, frankly, in what you have to say.
mm,
In terms of your comment on my piece, and frankly, most people are not interested in what I have to say either. So
mm,
it's a fairly limited pool you reach. Really, the only effective form of social media engagement in a campaign is paid, and it's worked very effectively. I mean, by the end of the campaign, um, this year, people were actively quite annoyed for the amount that they'd seen me or seen my content on Facebook. And you're going, brilliant. This is exactly the outcome I want because it means
mm,
people actually know who I am. They
mm,
forget you very quickly afterwards, I would say as well. That's the other funny thing is
mm,
now that I'm not actively on TikTok and everything all the time, you can wander through the street and no one really knows who
yeah.
you are unless you really sort of make a song and dance about it.
Mm,
But it is an easy route for trying to engage with people that evidences the fact you are actually doing something. The vast majority of what you're doing is responding to emails, frankly, all day, every day. Or going to a meeting, sitting there thinking about how you should be answering emails with that time. Um, but so you're not going to see that because corresponds with a small number of people. But social media gives you some way of just showing people I'm actually
exactly.
working pretty hard. But all in all, like I say, I think the planet would be a better place if all of it shut down tomorrow.
Mm. Um, and yeah, me and Tobias were coming from, a young generation. We're both 18, 19 years of age. So, that experience around social media, and its harmful effects, we see it a lot of the
Yeah,
time, especially with our friends, Tobias. No, I think we've both got people that we know that, I've been quite affected by it, in the past and
Yeah.
even currently now.
I mean,
Mhm.
I find it very interesting. So, I mean, so Facebook came online in 2005 when I was 19. So I was still relatively young, but the difference of not having that at a very young age, I can
Mm,
see is massive. And I have, in-laws and siblings and friends who are in that younger age category. And it's a matter of time I'm saying to them, just stop going on there. You're miserable because you keep going on there. Like
mm,
these are not real people. I tend to act, to be honest, as if a lot of the people commenting on Facebook or on Twitter are Russian bots, because actually, best case scenario, they're a Russian bot, because at least it has some reasonable logic to why they're doing what they're
exactly.
doing. Best case scenario, if they're just people sitting on there all the time just trying to make other people miserable, well, what kind of a life is that? They can't be very
Mm,
happy if that's the kind of people
mm,
that they are.
exactly.
But yeah, getting off social media is, I feel like it makes me sound like an old person saying it. Well, I am an old person now. But the whole thing I find entirely toxic. Yeah.
And
And the reality when you break it down, and we've got numbers around this, is most people on social media are actually very nice. But
mm,
they've stopped commenting. They're just lurking now because it's just not
yeah,
worth engaging
just not
with the
worth it
very
anymore.
small percentage of incredibly toxic people who happen
Mm,
to think that it's acceptable to be there. And the problem is that normalizes those people who think they do not realize what a tiny minority of opinion they are.
exactly.
Um, but if you meet these people in real life, they won't act that way, but they still think it's acceptable. But I've been very clear with people. When people write to me, if they use a tone like that or correspond, I ask them to apologize before I'm going to engage with them in their issue, because there is a basic level of human decency in society that we're supposed to have. I'm not asking for better treatment as elected representative. I'm asking you to treat me as another human being. And
Mm,
if you're not prepared to do that, then I'm not prepared to engage with you.
yeah.
And there is no legal obligation whatsoever
Mm.
that I have to do so.
And I think that there's an issue there as well where a lot of people don't see politicians as being, real sort of people. Like I've gone out with my MP a couple of times, like to schools and that
Mm.
sort of thing, and it's quite cool to see how people interact with him because they have this they think they have this superiority complex with him, and they're like, oh wow, he's an elected official, must be really good at these sort of things, and they're kind of like bowing down to him. Then you've got the other sort of people in a sense, who rubbish them and say, oh, they're career politicians, this sort of thing, this and that.
Yeah.
But I think people always do try forget that politicians at the end of the day, they're still people like us. They have the same issues. They go through a lot of the same things as we do, Um, they have families as well. So
Yeah.
sometimes that does get lost, in the sense in politics, people will see you on their phone, on TV, that sort of thing, and they'll be like, oh, these people are so far away from where I am. But in reality, a lot of the time they live within your communities and they're a part of
Yeah.
your life. So, they're not really that sort of far away sort of superior person compared to you, because at the end of the day, they are human beings just like you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the funny thing about my town is my wife describes it as a sort of a large, small town. I mean, her family's been here for a very long time, but the if I go out and I meet someone, it's almost certain we'll have a friend in common, you know,
Mm,
and that's the level of gap. And you still get stuff on social media about, well, I've never seen him before, coming from, well, maybe you haven't done, but to be honest, that's not a particularly strong sample size, is it? I mean,
mm,
you know, it's 120,000 people. You're not going to run into someone every day, but I have, you know, you're active enough within your community and you care about it. I mean, look, I've done this a long time, you know, and several things come out of that. One of which is, you know, much like you, I started young. The end result is I've been meeting cabinet ministers since I was a teenager. And as a result, I don't tend to view this as being particularly significant. So I don't view other politicians, regardless of their seniority, as being
mm.
particularly impressive, just meeting
Yeah,
them. I don't see why anyone should in any way give me any form of deference by being a member of parliament. The office requires a certain amount of respect, but I'm just another person who was born here and grew up in the community. You know, I just want to be treated like another human being at the end of the day.
mm,
Um, but yeah, there is that thing around. So I find it uncomfortable when people treat me with deference. I find it uncomfortable when people treat me rudely. But I'm at least used to dealing with that from the years
mm.
of local government. You know, I have been assaulted. I've had property of mine damaged and things like that over the years. You develop a thick skin. But like I was saying earlier about that, the problem is you don't want the only people involved in politics to be people who are like that. You want to
Mm.
have a broad swathe of public opinion. You want people to not predetermine that they're not going to get involved because they don't want to
Exactly.
be subject to abuse, because you lose out on an awful lot
That's the
of
problem.
people in the system that way. And while it might not hurt me, you know, I've got loved ones and they see what I tell them just not to go on my social media, you know, and they basically don't for that reason. But at the end of the day, when you go out and you're saying rude things about someone who you know nothing about and have no evidence for anything that you're saying, you know, do not imagine you're the only one affected. Like I say, I've got a lot of friends in this community in a lot of different roles. Chances are you know someone else if you live here that I also know, you know, and those are the people who you're also insulting, you know, as part of
Mm.
that process. You know, if I do
Exactly.
something wrong, absolutely nail me to the floor. But it's the stuff that you don't do wrong that you get
Mm.
most of the criticism about.
Exactly, exactly. I'm totally agree with you there, Peter. And at the end of the day, that's the real problem with politics now. We're just seeing a lot of this, you have to have a thick skin to join politics, and a lot of the great people, especially, and it's becoming such a toxic environment. A lot of, young professional women are, scared to join politics, and it's a real problem because politics has to be as diverse as the community is. And, if we have all the same sort of people representing us, it doesn't reflect the communities they represent. So it's really, really important that we have that sort of diversity. And sadly,
You know,
with the
after
toxicity, yeah,
yeah. I mean, after the recent sort of stabbings of MPs, and just about the first thing you do after you get handed your pass is you get handed a panic alarm that will track you wherever you are, so the police know. And you think to yourself, you know, it's only been three, almost four instances of MPs being stabbed over the last decade. But while I might look at that as a very low incidence, it does put people off immediately when they know that there is a physical risk attached to that. And I have no doubt whatsoever that social media is driving that, because the first stage before any genocide or any form of like mass killing or attack is to dehumanize a group of people so they don't deserve the same common status as anyone else. And politicians have entered into that category, but all viewed as being subhuman. You know, the irony being that we're changing politicians very frequently. And actually, when you look at the track record of politicians, first off, MPs are more likely now than ever before in UK history to come from their local community. And secondly, over recent parliaments, MPs have been more likely than ever before to rebel against their party whip on behalf of their community. And we've never been subject to as much enmity as we are now, because it's not grounded in fact. It's grounded in a combination of other factors, which people are finding online, very often just open lies about people.
it is quite frustrating. It really, really is, Peter. We're up to I think our fifth or sixth question here. So my question to you, Peter, is who would you say is your political role model or idol?
I mean, I don't think I've got a set one, to be honest. I think what is interesting, I mentioned earlier about Alf Pegler, who sort of built the town. I never met him. He died in 97, shortly before the Labour Party won the general election for the first time since 79. He was Laura Moffat, who was my predecessor as a Labour MP. He was her hero. You know, and Laura I look up to a lot. My first involvement in parliamentary stuff was I got work experience for her when I was 15. And a lot of the people who are friends to this day are people who were working in our office and I engaged with then. And it gives you a lot of experience. And I did say to her just the other day that I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. So I'm very grateful and looked up. But it's very interesting that despite never meeting Alf Pegler, you hear an awful lot about the culture of the party with a very clear sort of metropolitan socialist outlook connected to the town's history. And that I think that runs through an awful lot of the people in the party. And as a result, that's something I've picked up on. I think it's a shared sort of sense of direction and mission that exists within the party in Crawley. In terms of like the wider sort of sphere, my favourite Labour Prime Minister was Harold Wilson. Who was, I think, by any standard, was the most intelligent prime minister we've ever had as the UK, and managed to do phenomenal things in incredibly difficult circumstances, including being the only Labour leader to ever emerge with the Labour as the largest party at 4 general elections. But he was clearly immensely capable, and he managed to deliver some very sort of progressive things under very difficult circumstances. So he's someone I've looked up to a lot.
And that's quite interesting as well. Harold Wilson, especially after World War II, especially, taking over after Winston Churchill. At that point, it's a very tumultuous sort of time, especially, with Europe at that point.
That was so Attlee took over from Churchill.
Oh, Attlee, yes, sorry.
And then there was Churchill. Then there was Eden, Macmillan, Home, and then Wilson.
So he was he the 60s or the 70s?
He was 60s and 70s. He was in for a long time.
Okay, yeah, that sort of time, yes. So that in Australian context, that would have been probably the Harold Holt, John Gorton, Gough Whitlam sort of territory, around that sort of time. So yeah, and as you said, those sort of reforms that he pushed at that point are very, very important, and are a part of British society even to this day. I think you said that he was one who really pushed the NHS and that sort of.
No, that was Attlee, but
Attlee, yes.
The reason why Attlee is I think to some extent less impressive is that Attlee ran a cabinet of very big beasts. So you have people like Nye Bevan who built the NHS. You have people surrounding him like Ernest Bevin, who were sort of enormous Labour Party figures of the day, and his job was to basically coordinate between them, to sit above them and make sure that they didn't kill each other, frankly, around the cabinet table. But that was what delivered the change. Whereas in Harold Wilson's governments, I think he was much more obviously the driving force behind an awful lot of it. Particularly the clear agenda around the sort of white heat technology that the UK was its future lay in being a leader in terms of technological development, which at least for a period of time we were, until we decided to collapse our entire industry and go wholly into the banking sector, which has had mixed results.
Yeah. And I think we'll now move on now to our next question then for you, Peter. I think this is with you, Tobias.
Yeah, this is my last question. What made you run in the 2024 UK election for the Labour Party, and what made you join the Labour Party?
I joined the Labour Party when I realised, I came from a Labour family, but the thing which really made me think about, sort of my Damascene, my road to Damascus sort of moment, was really towards the end of secondary school, thinking about what I wanted to get out of life, the opportunities I wanted, the things I wanted in terms of my personal life, and realising how many of the people I was going to school with were not going to get those things. And getting very angry, realizing that they were perfectly capable people who had perfectly same right to expect a decent quality of life, and we had a system which was going to mean that an awful lot of those people were not going to make it. And it was after that I found out that when you look at social mobility, we have the lowest social mobility in the entire southeast. So it's been a driving force really of an awful lot of what I've done has been around how to ensure that people get those key things that enable them to progress in life in my particular community. And across the UK, but I think the fundamentals remain the same. In terms of running for Parliament, it was a combination of things. It's, that is an underlying mission as to what we want to see change in the town. That's what I tried to do when I was a council leader. But as I said previously, you run into hurdles with national government. Yes. We have some amazing projects that we came so close to delivering at the last minute. Some national agency that's unaccountable to the local level, notionally accountable to a minister, but you can't get through to them via our MP at the time because he wasn't largely sympathetic. get in the way, and immediately all of that effort and all that opportunity just disappear because of someone's stroke of the pen. And I'm frankly having quite a good time at the moment writing to a lot of those people expressing my disapproval. These are things that I could not fix as a council leader, even though actually, like I said earlier, that was probably a role that was far more fun on a day-to-day level. Or at least not so much fun, but rewarding on a day-to-day level because you could see the impact that you were doing.
Yeah.
My job is to make sure that those things that get in the way can be pulled back so that the community, both in terms of the council and other agencies in the area, can make the town have that opportunity to thrive. Beyond that, there's clearly a national mission around tackling inequality and delivering better life standards for the UK as a whole, which very clearly was not the case under the Conservatives, which got wrapped up in sort of psychodrama leadership politics from about 2015 onwards.
And going back to why you ran in the 2024 election, I do remember previously doing some research. You also ran in the 2019 election for Crawley as well against Henry Smith again. So with a lot of lessons you learned from that campaign that you used again for 2024, and what was some of course, like what were some of the learning curves that you figured out in that campaign that you tried to use this time around?
I mean, having been a former Labour Party organiser, I was fairly familiar with campaigns, and I'd been an election agent for various people who'd run in the constituency for a number of times. So I'd kind of designed the campaigns in 2010, 2015, 2017, and then was the candidate in 2019 and 2024. So there was quite a lot of experience already there. It is different when you're the candidate. You go from being a salesperson to being the product, in particular, and you have to think a lot more about your motivations for doing things, about how you're going to engage around particular topics. It stops being more tactical as well, because I think when you're trying to sell someone else, your tactical approach to how am I going to get this person in, what's the right formulation of language and the ways to get them in. When you're the candidate yourself, you've got to think to yourself about, well, actually, am I going to do those things to get to office? I never ever want to say that I'm going to commit to doing something and then find that later down the road I'm going to do the opposite. Like, it's really important to me. And actually, with local manifestos, I wrote one every single year when I was council leader, because we had elections every year, we elected in thirds. I made sure I'd never broke anything in there, and they're still up available on our website for people to check us against what we committed to. Even things that we didn't put in there, but people thought we'd committed to, that were tough, we delivered on, because that trust is so vital. But 2019, the key thing I learned from 2019 to 2024 is it's much more fun running an election where the opinion polls have you 20 points up rather than 20 points behind. Overwhelmingly, in most people's experience as a candidate, the defining thing as to whether or not you're going to succeed is going to be national opinion polling rather than anything you do on the ground. You can change things by about 5% on the ground. It's quite hard to really affect the overall picture. But of course, you're a bit more practice. A few more people. I think there's a presumption once you've run once and lost that you're going to be the candidate the next time as well, which makes it easier to get back in and have those connections. But it was a very different experience in people's organisations, in particular, willingness to engage with me. And just one thing I would say to those organisations is don't think people forget the way they're treated the first time they meet you compared to the second time. When they know that you're clearly in it or purely for yourself as an organisation rather than out of a genuine desire to engage with figures across the political field, your chance of getting something positive out of that person's subsequent election is much less. And
yes,
as a result.
And as you were saying, the difference between even if you're on even a good strong local campaign, you can still lose if the opinion polls have a massive lead. I think that's all across the world. We've got a lot of great, especially we had a recent election in the Northern Territory, in Darwin, a couple of weeks back, and there were some really popular local Labor members up there, who lost their seats either to independents or to the Country Liberal Party. And they were still very popular, and they might have gotten a lesser swing compared to the average. But at the end of the day, if there's a swing happening, as you saw in 2019, no matter how well your campaign is, you can't stop that sort of swing from materializing in a sense.
I think possibly the best campaign I've ever run was a local election campaign in 2021. We hadn't had an election in 2020 due to COVID. It's the only year Crawley has never had an election. So we had two tiers of the county tier and the district tier up at the same time. And we did a lot of innovative stuff in that year, and a lot of, to make up for the fact we couldn't have the level of face-to-face contact, content. During the time we were all locked down, we hand wrote letters to every single swing voter in our target wards. We did everything we possibly could to work our way around the system, and we thought we ran a very effective campaign, and we lost a seat overall. We did worse than at the previous election when we had notionally been worse off in the opinion polls. So you don't really control these things. The national swing does, like you say.
Exactly.
The one thing I would say about it though is if you look at statistically equivalent seats to Crawley, they were up that year. They didn't lose one seat; they lost more like 6 to 8 seats. So clearly, the impact we had was in lessening the blow. But unfortunately, most people vote for top of the ticket at the end of the day. They vote for the national. Then another section votes for whatever their local trend tends to be. And it's about 10% in the end vote on the basis of local candidate. There are things you can do around that. I mean, you can push up turnout through various activities, but it really is at the margins. And that's why parties target very heavily. And the Labour Party's success, and actually, to some extent, the Liberals had a much more effective campaign than the Labour Party did. When you look at the number of seats they've got now, it's almost up there with the same number of seats the Conservatives have, the Liberal Democrats, despite having, a very small share of the overall vote. But it was very highly targeted. And essentially what voters did was they split in the constituency. They decided in every constituency whether Labour or the Lib Dems were more likely to get the candidate, the party out. And vote for that particular party. The Lib Dems did a very effective campaign, I think, because they have far fewer resources to get those results. And I don't know if you saw any of it in Australia, but because they're the third party and everyone wanted to talk about the Labour Party and the party in government, they really struggled to get coverage on the TV, with the end result being that Ed Davey, their party leader, every single press event he did was like a stunt. So it was like bungee jumping off of something, or whitewater rafting, or like being on like a
I think, I saw those
sort of
videos as well.
ride.
It's
fantastic, but it works. It was really clever, like what they did. I have so much admiration for the Lib Dem campaign, like back in July. It was brilliant.
Yeah, they had a great campaign, honestly. And there was a lot of people doubting them at that point, saying, this is just all, it was giving people, it was just all hilarious, like stunt. They weren't taking it seriously. But at the end of the day, it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. Doesn't matter how you do it. If it works, it works. So that's the most important
I remember
thing.
being told once about, I think it was like putting your face on business cards, and they're like, yeah, it's incredibly cheesy. You want cheesy. Cheesy is good. Cheesy gets you in people's minds. Like you're not fighting against their impression of you. You're fighting them against them not having any impression of you whatsoever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more name recognition, the better. And sometimes, as people say, even bad publicity is good publicity sometimes. At least you're getting your name out there.
Yeah, the name recognition one is an interesting one, I find, because I think the best example I have of it is like internal party elections, or like trade union elections, or like where you're part of a membership organization where you get a ballot paper through of like 30 people and you've got to vote for 15 of them, and you've never heard of like the vote majority. Like if there's one name on there that you recognize, and it doesn't matter what the context is, they're almost guaranteed to get your vote in that ballot regardless, purely because they're the only one, and you've got to pick so many people. Yeah, it's incredibly powerful name recognition.
Totally agree with you there, Peter. So we'll move on now to our final question for you, Peter. So finally, what's one piece of advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially those I know in the UK now who have recently started university or high school?
Just in general, or in politics?
In general, really, in general.
I think my advice to people would be that you need to be flexible. You've got to take advantage of every possible opportunity. I did not choose a career path that ended up to where I am. I exploited any opportunity that was presented in front of me, because the reality is that the world is not. I think it's an increasing tendency to view this as being some sort of narrative game that we're all playing, and that is our story that's being told in a movie, and everyone else is a non-player character, and we're just waiting for a grand moment. Sorry, the world doesn't particularly care about you. It would be fairly indifferent if you weren't here. The way that you get to somewhere that you're comfortable with is not by choosing a perfect path. It's by taking every opportunity that is in front of you. Day one out of university, that means getting any job available. It's something that pays, because your employer is going to be looking, or future employers will be looking to see that you've got some experience. Frankly, that you can turn up from 9 to 5 and put in the hours, and it can be miserable sometimes, but that is something they don't know that for sure that you can do. Getting involved in like extracurricular activities that might be of importance. Like I said earlier, the most important things for my political development were debating society, being an editor in a newspaper, and things like that. Going along to like your organizations that are of relevance to you, where you may want to be able to network with people who will be of importance in the future. An awful lot of jobs, one heck of a lot of jobs, particularly significant jobs, are never really advertised. They go through people who know people, and that isn't how the system should work, but that's how the system does work. So networking within those industries that you want to work in, and being prepared to do embarrassing things. I said a moment ago about being cheesy, be prepared to be the person who does say to the person, so do you have any jobs going, or could you recommend me, or, put something forward? It's just, you've got to be prepared to tough it out, to be flexible,
Exactly.
to go for every opportunity. Like, the world can be your oyster, but you don't get to be picky. You have to really
Yeah.
put in exceptionally hard graft. And frankly, for much of my working life, I've been working to close to 20-hour days to get here. And I feel very, very tired. But I'm quite happy
A
with
lot
the
of coffee's
outcomes of
been
what I've produced.
a lot of coffee's
A
been
lot of
consumed.
coffee, a lot of more powerful caffeine drinks than coffee that my wife is been trying to wean me off now since we got married. But the end result is you cover an awful lot of miles. And while I don't recommend to anyone going without sleep, sorry, sometimes you've got to be prepared to do the thing that you really, really don't want to do. And absolutely, when it comes to political campaigns, and you all know this from being involved, sometimes when it's absolutely pouring with rain, and you've got this enormous pile of leaflets that has got to go out, and your days are running down, it is being prepared to go out there in terrible conditions and tough it out. And that is true for everyone. And I had a friend who started work with a cabinet minister in the last Labour government. Actually, I think it's probably work experience he was doing, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to get away with this. But he started work experience with a senior cabinet minister who was viewed as being a potential new party leader when the next election happened. And the first thing he had him doing was going out with him delivering leaflets, because the point he was making is this doesn't stop. Like, the whole way through the system, you're always paying your dues. No one gets to just sit back and have things come to them. You really got to go out there and you've got to do it. But be nice to people along the way.
Yeah.
Certainly in politics, it's always true.
Yeah.
You're never quite sure who the person who you pissed off is not going to be the person who you're next trying to get a job out of. If you're
Exactly.
even if it feels like you can't stand this person, just be nice to them. Imagine that they are the ballot that's going to put you across the line in an election. And it's one of the funny things I found is that for all the unpleasantness in politics, I think politics actually made me a nicer person, because you have to be nice to people in order to survive in this, in order to progress through. And if you just always act as if you're up for election, you'll treat people with decency, with respect, and with kindness, and we'll have a better country all around. Well, better planet.
Better planet, yeah.
That was very long for a piece of advice, but yeah.
Very good piece of advice there, Peter. Very, very good. I think all our listeners will take that on, hopefully. And, if they want to progress in their political careers, they could. And, especially that advice, taking every single opportunity that's possible in the future. For a lot of our university, high school students, it's really, really important.
I think for every time I was looking for a job, I'd send off roughly 100 cover letters before I got one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you just got to put in the effort, and at the end of the day, your effort will be returned with rewards if you keep putting yourself in that position. So, yeah, those are all our questions for you, Peter. I do really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been nearly 2 hours, so hopefully it's been an enjoyable experience for you. And I know me and Tobias have really enjoyed it ourselves. So we do really appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us and talking a bit about your career in politics and some advice you'd give to students, who might want to go into politics, or just want to maybe have a career in the private sector, or a career in any sort of facet.
Well, thank you both very much, and I wish you all the best with the podcast.